Alright, good morning. Why am I standing outside? Well, we just had our first snowfall here in Wisconsin. Thought it'd be some nice backdrop for the intro here. But anyways, I wanted to take a break and talk about the Final Fantasy series. It's a series I've spent like over thousands of hours playing through it. Was my favorite series for a long time. Yeah, but I thought it'd be cool to take a look back at all the games and just give you my brief opinions on them. And I pretty much finished every game on this list with the exception of, like, you know, Crystal Chronicles, Tactics Advanced 2, and what's that? Final Fantasy XIII. So let's take a look. So I had first played this one on the Final Fantasy Origins collection on the original PlayStation, and it's a pretty good game. You know, obviously since this originally came out back in the NES days and was the first in the series, it, you know, wasn't the deepest story or deepest battle system, but it was still really good. And it was pretty challenging too, and probably not something I'd ever go back and play again, but I did enjoy it. Moving along, we have Final Fantasy II. Again, this was in the Final Fantasy Origins collection on the original PlayStation. And I enjoyed this one a lot, even though I know this is like probably the least popular game in the numbered series. A lot of people think the battle system is way too easy to exploit. And, you know, I guess while it is, I never choose to exploit it. I'm not really into exploiting battle systems. That's not my thing. I enjoyed the game a lot. The story is a little bit deeper than the original Final Fantasy, and overall it's a pretty good game. So Final Fantasy III would be my least favorite of the main series. The one thing I did like about it, it was extremely challenging, and I think I remember like the last boss had like 3 attacks per turn or something ridiculous. Another thing I did like was the job system. However, there were some negative aspects to it. For one, when you'd switch to a new job, there'd be kind of a learning period, and your characters would actually be pretty weak for about, I don't know, 8 to 15 battles. So that was annoying. Other thing was that it says, you know, you can choose whatever job you want at any time, but really that's not true, because whenever you enter a town, it's only going to have weapons for the job that they think you should have. So if you're not in that job, you're not going to be able to upgrade your weapons, and you're going to have a tough time in the next dungeon. And then we have Final Fantasy IV. I had originally played this on Final Fantasy Chronicles on the PlayStation, and it was a very, very challenging game. And I actually got stuck. I'm not sure what the name of the place was, but I kept running out of ethers, so I kind of gave up halfway through the game. And it wasn't until the DS remake years later that I finally finished it. And a lot of people claim that the DS remake is the more challenging game of the two, and I actually thought it was easier because, you know, you have a map on the bottom screen to show where you are in the dungeons, and what made the PlayStation version so tense is because I really had no clue where I was going. Another thing about the DS version is you get free items when you clear the dungeon map, get 100% on it. And also the augment system, which allows you to have extra abilities for each party member. A lot of times you do have to go out of your way to find them, but they do make the game a lot easier. You know, still not a bad game. was excellent. One of my favorites in the series, actually. And if you have a DS or a PSP, I highly recommend picking up Final Fantasy IV. Now, Final Fantasy V is a game that kind of gets overlooked by a lot of people, and there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, it was never released in the US until Final Fantasy Anthology on the PlayStation. Secondly, it was sandwiched between two of the best games in the series, 4 and 6. And, you know, I like this game a lot. It really improved on the job system from Final Fantasy III. In fact, the job system is almost as good as Tactics. Not quite, but it's really, really good, really deep. There's a lot of there's just a lot of possibilities for abilities you can have, and it's a lot of fun. The only real flaw, in my opinion, is the story isn't really that great. Characters are somewhat interesting, but the story leaves a lot to be desired. Good game, well worth picking up and checking out. Final Fantasy VI is another game I missed out in the Nintendo era, or Super Nintendo era, I should say. I did play it on the original PlayStation and then later on the Game Boy Advance. And this is actually my favorite numbered game in the series for many reasons. First of all, the story is just excellent. It has lots of memorable characters, and I really love the combat because the characters all have their own sets of abilities, but at the same time there is also a very flexible magic system through you know, learning magic through espers. So it has a nice balance to it, and the music is one of the best soundtracks in the series, hands down. I used to own the soundtrack and listen to it a lot. If you're looking for a good place to start in the series, I would say this is the best one to start with. So Final Fantasy VII was obviously the first entry on the PlayStation, first game in 3D, and you know, it's a pretty good game. It's not my favorite in the series. The moment at the end of Disc 1, however, is probably one of the best scenes in video game history. Yeah, it's a pretty good game. I'm just not blown away by it like everybody else was, probably because it wasn't the first game I played. It does have a really good soundtrack, pretty decent story. There are some translation issues, and the graphics are they're really weird because they're like, you know, beautiful pre-rendered backgrounds combined with blocky characters, and it looks really odd in my opinion. And you know, if there's ever one game in the series that could, you know, begs for a remake, it's this game, and I'm really shocked that Square Enix hasn't gotten around to doing it, because this game could really benefit from it. You know, analog controls, DualShock capabilities, voice acting, all that. So I'm not sure why, you know, what the problem is, why they're not doing it, but whatever. And then there's Final Fantasy Tactics. This was actually the first strategy RPG I ever played, and to this day it's still my favorite. The only game that's come close is the original Dissidia. And the game is just a blast to play. It's incredibly deep, and I've played through both the PSP version and the original PlayStation version multiple times, and probably logged more than 700 hours into this game, and I never get sick of it and never gets old. I love the job system. It's incredibly flexible, incredibly deep. The story is excellent, and it has an epic soundtrack. Probably will always be my favorite strategy RPG of all time. Now, this was actually the first game in the series that I played. I didn't own an NES or a Super Nintendo back in the day, so I didn't even know what the series was, and I kept seeing them mention this game in the official PlayStation magazine. So I decided to try the demo out, and I wasn't blown away by it, but it was pretty good. And ended up purchasing the game and just loved it. It was had a great battle system. I love the junction system. I know a lot of people think it's too easy or whatever, but I enjoyed it a lot. The soundtrack for this game is a little weird though, because it has like some of the songs are like the best in the series, but then a lot of it is just really mediocre. So it's very unbalanced as far as the soundtrack goes. But I really enjoyed the characters. The graphics were amazing for a PlayStation game, and they still look pretty good to this day. And I like the fact that by the end of the game you just feel uber powerful. For a long time this was my favorite game in the series, although it was replaced by 4 and then later on 6. But, it's always something that I'm going to enjoy. And I'm actually on my 10th playthrough of it now, if you can believe that. The final installment in the Final Fantasy series on the PlayStation 1 was pretty amazing. It was basically like kind of like a tribute to the previous games in the series, and it was a lot of fun. The only downside was the battle system was a little slow, but it was really cool. Characters had their own abilities again. There wasn't so much customization as in the previous games. Yeah, overall just a really fun game, really likable characters, and the soundtrack was just phenomenal. One of my favorites in the series. So then there was Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, the first movie in the franchise, and it was kind of the beginning of the end for Squaresoft. The thing a lot of people complain about is it has very little to do with Final Fantasy, and they're right, with the exception of like the whole Terra Gaia thing. There's really not much to do with the series at all. But other than that, it's actually a pretty good movie, and they should have just dropped the Final Fantasy name from it, entirely, and just called it The Spirits Within. But, even that wouldn't have saved it. It still, didn't make the money back that it needed to, and pretty much forced a merger with Enix, and also forced out a bunch of the main people who were in charge of the previous Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy X was actually the third game I picked up for my PlayStation 2, and I had been waiting for this game. I was very excited about it, and it did not let me down. It had a great story, great characters, even though Yuna's voice acting was pretty bad. Excellent music, and the combat was just amazing. I liked it because you could take your time if you needed to, but if you didn't feel like taking your time, it was a very fast-paced battle system. It was also really cool how flexible the limit breaks or overdrives were, and cool that you could summon your Aeons and you could actually give them commands in battle. About the only downside to this game is some of the side quests to unlock the ultimate weapons were a bit annoying, but otherwise an excellent game. And then we get to Final Fantasy X-2, and as you can see, it is completely different than Final Fantasy X. Yuna is now some kind of pop star, and the game's story is kind of dumb, and Final Fantasy X didn't need a sequel. The ending was just great, and this game kind of brings down Final Fantasy X a little bit. I know a lot of people like the combat, and combat is pretty good. The one thing I don't like is a lot of the skills are kind of useless because and the time it takes to get off a skill, you'll actually be able to defeat the enemies with your regular attacks while you're waiting for that. Other than that, it's got a really good soundtrack, even though it wasn't done by the normal Final Fantasy music guy. But yeah, really mediocre game. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance is one of the most disappointing sequels I've ever played. For a lot of reasons. For one, the story is very simplistic. The main character gets sucked into a fantasy world and wants to go home. That's pretty much it to the story. But the big thing is the battle system, the combat. It just seems like it was really dumbed down for the Nintendo audience. Like they thought that no hardcore gamers played Nintendo systems, and they just made everything too easy, too simple. And the music is pretty terrible in this one too. I don't like it at all. Someday I will do a review on this game because I want to go into more detail into why I don't like this game. Okay, now this one, I admit I only spent like 2 or 3 hours on it, and I really wasn't enjoying it at all. The combat was really annoying with the stupid ring that you had to stay inside, and it just didn't seem like a fun game at all. So I pretty much skipped it, and from what I hear, as a single player game, it's not the greatest. It's really meant for multiplayer, so maybe unfair that I'm bashing it, but whatever. And then there was Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. Now this was actually better than the Spirits Within in some ways, and a lot worse in others. First of all, on positives, you know, it had a lot more to do with the Final Fantasy series, and it had some great action scenes, but on the downside, the story was almost non-existent, and what was there was pretty terrible. Translation was a little and it just had some really cheeseball lines in it and stuff. And some of the action scenes were really annoying because they did a lot of fast camera angles, and you know, I can understand why you would do that with live actors, but when you're dealing with CG, there's really no need to do that. And I think it actually brought down like the fight with Tifa inside the church. I think that would have been a lot better if they didn't do all those quick camera angles. One thing about it though is the soundtrack is just phenomenal. They redid a lot of the songs from the original Final Fantasy VII, and my favorites were Tifa's piano theme and the metalized version of One Winged Angel, which was just amazing. So, you know, if you're watching it just for the action, it's a really good movie, but if you're watching it for the story, stay away. And then we get to Final Fantasy XII. I really enjoyed this game the first, I don't know, about 15 hours or so. And then after that, the story just kind of disappeared, and you know, all you're left with is just a really monotonous, boring dungeon crawler that pretended to be an online RPG, and it was just a turn-based battle system. And you know, you can run around in battles, so you would think you'd be able to evade attacks, but you really can't. Yeah, overall it was just a really boring game, and yeah, that's it. Now, Dissidia Final Fantasy was a game that I originally was just going to ignore because at the time Square Enix had like, I don't know, like 10 different Final Fantasy games in development, and I hadn't been exactly blown away by the previous games I had played. But I decided to download a demo of it, and I loved it immediately. And you know, picked up the game day one, spent like 200 hours playing it, and it's a fun game. You know, the combat is really simple, but you know, it's really deep with the battle abilities you can use, and all the equipment you can find, and moves for the characters that you can unlock. So overall, it was one of the few new games that I really enjoyed after Final Fantasy X. Actually, it was the only new game I enjoyed after Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance II is another game I really couldn't get into too much. And you know, I had played the Game Boy Advance, the previous Game Boy Advance game, and you know, I did play through that game all the way, but this game pretty much seems like more of the same with a slightly different law system, and I just couldn't get into it. I played about 5 or 6 hours and it seemed really boring yet again. Now, Final Fantasy XIII, I haven't played this one. I really wasn't too excited about it after pretty much wasting my money on Crystal Chronicles, Tactics Advance 2, 10-2, and 12. So, you know, I wasn't about to waste any more money on new games in the series when the previous ones had disappointed me so much. From what I hear, it's a pretty mediocre Final Fantasy game. Of course, the graphics look amazing, but, you know, it's just a really linear quest, and it doesn't sound exciting at all. Alright, I hope you guys enjoyed watching. Someday I probably will do some reviews on some of these games. There are a lot of games in this series that I have a lot to say about, both good and bad. Get around to that someday, but till next time.